All right, everyone. It looks like we are streaming and we are live on YouTube and Facebook. Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Jake Varghese. Thank you for joining us for our first ever Justice Town Hall series. The Justice Town Hall series is something we created to examine justice from every angle. What do we mean by that is pretty simple. We're going to look at justice from every angle. So we're going to look at criminal justice, environmental justice, housing justice, education justice, etc. And we're going to keep going through those until we solve problems. Inside of each of these series, we're actually going to have tracks of different topics. So inside of the criminal justice series today is the history part of the track. Why do we need to go over history? Well, from an engineering standpoint, I can tell you that it's very, very difficult to solve problems when you don't know how you got the problem. And so it's very important that we uncover some of the, let's say, revisionism that's going into the criminal justice history that we have. And we need to unpack that and take a look at what really happened so that we can actually solve the problems correctly. Our Revolution East Bay is a local chapter of Our Revolution, which was founded in the wake of the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. And we draw our leadership from Nina Turner, Jim Hightower, Larry Cohen, Ben Jealous, James Ogby, and many other notable progressives. Our job is to elect progressives at every level of government and enhance the community around us. Last cycle, we won 25 out of 34 endorsed races locally in 2020 and won over 70% of our endorsed races nationally in 2020. We are the only truly national grassroots progressive organization fighting at every level of government. Please join us at ourrevolutioneastbay.org. And now I'm going to pass it over to our co-sponsors, the Coalition for Police Accountability, and my co-host, Kathy Leonard. Kathy, are you ready? Oh, looks like you're muted.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Leonard. I'm on the steering committee of the Coalition for Police Accountability. I'm sure you've all heard of our organization and also Measure LL. So LL was created in 2016 by 83% of the voters. And basically what Measure LL did was seat the police commission and the community police review agency. The police commission is tasked to oversee and create policy by the Oakland Police Department, and they can terminate the police chief with cause. The Community Police Review Agency investigates complaints against police officers that are filed by civilians and recommends discipline. They also audit the Oakland Police Department's compliance with reforms which were mandated by the federal monitor back so many, many years, 18 years ago. Number two will be kind of encapsulated in number three, which is Measure S1. So 81% of Oakland voters passed Measure S1, which was to strengthen the oversight powers of the Oakland Police Commission. One of the issues that faced the police commission was independence. They didn't have their own attorney, so they had to rely upon counsel and advice from the city attorney's office, who also represents the Oakland Police Department. So you can see that there is a conflict of interest in representing both of these parties. The other thing about Measure S1 was it's seating an inspector general. And that person will be tasked with investigating and reviewing the city's handling of police misconduct. So that's what, Measure S1 actually seated these two positions, which will be staffed under the police commission. They report to the police commission, and therefore they have much more authority than they ever had under Measure S1, or more authority, I should say. So that's the skinny on what the work that we've been doing since, before 2016. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kathy. So let's talk about today. So let's talk about today's agenda. Today is the Criminal Justice Series, which is the history track. And today's speakers will be Dr. Bilal Ware, Pamela Price, Esquire, Dr. Jody Armour, and Chesa Boudin, Esquire. Since we created this town hall to not just educate the public, but we also wanted to educate public officials because they are the ones that are already empowered to take this knowledge and apply it immediately. So in that vein, we have a Q&A panelists made up of former and current elected officials. We have Gus Newport, former Berkeley mayor, Kate Harrison, Berkeley City Council member, Gail McLaughlin, Richmond City Council member, Melvin Willis, Richmond City Council member, Javanka Beckles, AC Transit Council, and Barisha Spriggs, Alameda Dems Central Committee. And so with that, let's go ahead and let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bilal Ware, who is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and specializes in pre-modern West African history. His research interests include Islam, popular religious culture, and race. He is the author of several books, which we have a list of on our description page for the town hall and under each video on YouTube and Facebook. And after the Q&A panelists for their questions, we're going to take questions from the audience members at Facebook and YouTube. So if you're watching the live stream, please add your questions and comments to those platforms, and we'll pick them up and ask them during that time. Dr. Ware, are you ready and unmuted?
I am ready and unmuted.
Great. Let me go ahead and stop sharing, and you can go ahead and start. All right.
I'm just going to say a few words before I share my screen. It's an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to be in such an auspicious gathering as this one, where the struggle is for justice. In the academic world, sometimes it tends to get lost. So I feel fortunate to be able to be part of this discussion today. So as Jake mentioned, I'm a historian of West Africa, also teach African American history. And I actually specialize in the history of abolitionist struggles in West Africa and in African American communities. So I wanted to provide some deep historical context to the contemporary freedom struggles that are facing our community and allow us to situate ourselves in a deeper lineage of struggle to face up, frankly, to the challenges of white supremacist systems that seek to commoditize Black life, that seek to put carceral restraints on humanity of color, especially. So I'm going to take you guys first back into the history of slavery before we move into closer to the present. This is from a text from 1845 written by a very forward-thinking Christian evangelist. The book was entitled Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. This is from a forward-thinking white evangelical who supposed that beating enslaved Africans over the head with the Bible and telling them that they could serve masters in heaven as they had served them on earth was probably not going to be a very effective means of trying to spread morality and righteousness amongst the enslaved community. So he gathered a series of stories that suited those rhetorical purposes. And this appeared in one of those passages. It is the story of an enslaved African man who had actually struggled against the institution of slavery before being sold as a slave. And I'll just read it because it'll get us into today's topic. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, John Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single as suited the purchasers, a middle-aged man was put upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Mohammedan and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties came, he must have time to attend to them. Mr. Doherty, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself he would soon convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required and in addition should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Jesus Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after them. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that. The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and at an advanced age died, declaring that God was one God and Muhammad was his prophet. This story related to an evangelical in the early part of the 19th century captures, sorry for the play on words, the fact that already as enslaved Africans were disembarking from boats that were bringing them into carceral bondage in the United States of America, they were armed with moral, rhetorical, political, and historical tools to critique and attempt to dismantle the systems that held them in bondage. And the first lesson that I drew from this when I began speaking, especially in the African American community and the Muslim community this past summer after the Floyd uprisings, was that the first resource that we have is to actually mine our histories, to not assume that we are facing these problems anew. And the second lesson was that if we don't situate ourselves in the abolitionist genealogies of our forefathers, then how will history write about us? I asked the question of our community and of our community leadership, will the histories that are written of this era 100 years from now question us the way that we question those who were complicit with slavery? Will they ask, where were you when millions of people were being held in bondage, when the United States of America was becoming the single largest carceral state to ever exist in human history? What efforts did we make to stand up to resist that? And that's the next part of the presentation that I want to take us to, is a history of a struggle against that actually produced that man on that Savannah dock, and indeed produced, as it happens, the ancestors of a number of people, prominent abolitionists, as it happens, in the African American community. So this is a quotation that comes from my first book, which is a history of struggles against colonialism and imperialism in West Africa. And this is an excerpt from a book called Letters on the Slave Trade that's written by the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. The Reverend Thomas Clarkson, as it happens, is the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, the first modern abolitionist institution founded anywhere in the Western world. He is actually the tutor in all things anti-slavery of William Wilberforce, who ends up becoming a much more widely known name, a name that might have passed some of your eyes when you were reading histories of struggles against the institution of slavery. In Clarkson's first work on the topic of struggle against the slavery and in making his advocacy to European governments, he actually cites African Muslim scholars, intellectuals, and activists who had already abolished the institution of slavery in West Africa in the year, as it happens, of 1776, the same year of the American Revolution. So I'm just going to read a passage now from Clarkson's first work on abolition, as he attributes to al-Mami, which is a Fulani pronunciation of the term imam, al-imam. So it's just a leader. To the sovereigns of Europe, the wise and virtuous imam sets an illustrious example in extirpating the commerce in the human race. And when we consider this amiable man as having been trained up in a land of slavery and as having had in the introduction of such a revolution all the prejudices of education and custom to oppose, when we consider him again as sacrificing a part of his own revenue, as refusing the presence of Europeans, and as exposing himself in consequence of it to the vindictive ravages of the agents of the latter, he is certainly more to be respected than any of the sovereigns of Europe, inasmuch as he has made a much nobler sacrifice than they and has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion. Anglican priest, writing in 1790 to praise an African Muslim for doing more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion than any of the rulers of Europe. Not satisfied with these proceedings, the Imam made a decree as a discouragement to the slave trade in the beginning of the year 1787, that whereas slaves made in other distant countries had been accustomed to be passed in their way to Fort St. Louis, this is Saint Louis, for those of you that might have been to Senegal, On their way to Fort St. Louis through his dominions, no such passage should be allowed them in the future, and accordingly, at the proper season of the year, he put his decree into execution by stopping the passage of slaves. They tried him next by many and rich presents, but he sent them all back, adding that he would not only hinder the route of the slaves for that year, but as long as he should live, and that if the whites should attempt any depredations on his subjects in consequence of his determination, he would retaliate. His next step was to prohibit the sale of the persons of men, and to abolish personal slavery in his own dominions, giving encouragement to agriculture and manufacture. When I read this in academic environments, people are shocked and astounded to have the genealogies of liberty, the genealogies of freedom, the genealogies of anti-slavery struggles connected to African antecedents, rather than emerging, as it were, like Athena from the waves, fully formed from European post-Enlightenment rationalist thought. It's worth noting that amongst those enslaved Africans that had struggled against the institution of slavery before being sent into bondage and brought to these very shores, that there were ancestors of some of our most prominent abolitionist advocates in African American history. Among them, for example, to tie it directly to this story of this African Muslim struggles, and by the way, there were anti-slavery struggles led by African Christians in the Congo. There were anti-slavery struggles led by practitioners of traditional African religions. They drew on the resources of their own cultures and their own communities to struggle against the fundamental injustice of their age, which is the call that obtains for us today as we try to struggle against the fundamental injustice of our age. The commoditization of human life and the reduction of human beings to bondage. So back to the genealogy. Among the prominent enslaved African Muslims, and by the way, this slave trade brought between 13 and 20 million Africans into bondage in the New World. It's estimated, I'm a specialist of Islam in West Africa, that 10 to 15% of those were Muslims, which also, by the way, is a useful narrative to grab onto in our communities when we are being told that, by Islamophobes, that Islam has nothing to do with American history. Africans bring Islam to these shores before there is a United States of America. It's a useful reminder, but they also bring genealogies of struggle for liberation. The maternal lineage of Frederick Douglass, America's greatest abolitionist, I think without question. On his maternal, it's well known that on his paternal side, he was fathered most likely by his own owner, who never liberated him. He liberated himself. But on his maternal side, his mother's last name was Bailey. Now, what's interesting is he came from those very same sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia, where the narrative that I led tonight's talk came from, and where many of the Muslims that were brought to the United States of America in the 1770s, 1780s, and 1790s were brought. Now, strikingly, there are no white Baileys in any of the census records on any of those sea islands, but there's lots and lots of Bilalis, which is a very common African name taken by West African Muslims. It is indeed the name that I chose for myself when I converted to Islam at the age of 15, Bilal. A formerly enslaved person who ends up becoming the second adult to convert to the religion of Islam and one of its principal intellectuals. The reason why I mention this is that a number of historians are of the opinion that Frederick Douglass' maternal lineage was likely Bilali and became anglicized as Bailey. That the greatest abolitionist in African American history was very likely descended from the very same anti-slavery struggles that I just outlined, which gives us a different kind of depth for our struggles. These struggles, especially for those of us that are Black and Black adjacent, is to understand that this is a struggle that African resources, intellectual, political, cultural, moral, and ethical, have been marshaled against for centuries, and that we need to root ourselves within the power of our own communities, within the power of our own histories, within the truth of our own struggles in order to stand up to the fundamental challenge of our time. And I'll end with one last word from the West African Islamic tradition that I think might be beneficial in today's gathering. In the Islamic understanding of the creation story, the first thing to understand is that the name Adam means black in ancient Arabic. And when the frame of Adam is molded and God breathes of his own breath into the human ancestor, our common ancestor, in order to animate, there's a creature that's present that is commanded to bow to the frame of that shared human ancestor. That one is the one that we end up calling the devil. And when he's commanded to bow, he refuses, and he says, I'm better than him. You made him from clay, and you made me from fire. West African Islamic scholars will often remind us that the devil is the first racist. And he has been trying to convince us to see one another with the same contempt that he has for all of us. We must therefore take this as a moral and ethical struggle and not just a political one. Because indeed, this effort to confine people because they are Black, because they are brown, is a cosmic struggle. It is beyond just a sociological. And I'll end with that. Thanks.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Ware. So for our next guest, Pamela Price, my co-host, Kathy Leonard, is going to introduce her. Kathy, you ready? Looks like you're muted still. There we go. Uh-oh.
Our next panelist is Pamela Price. Pamela Price is a nationally recognized pioneer in employment discrimination and civil rights cases. Attorney Price regularly wins difficult cases of sexual harassment, racial harassment, and discrimination in federal and state courts. She also won a case or two in front of the US Supreme Court. Her legal advocacy for women stems from her own experience as a survivor of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and domestic violence. I give you attorney Pamela Price.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you all for having me. I am honored to be a member of the Coalition for Police Accountability and to have represented the coalition in a federal lawsuit where we attempted to bring the community's voice into the long-standing, overdue consent decree that no longer seems to serve its purpose for the most part. I'm also a member of Our Revolution East Bay and have been proudly endorsed by that organization in my quest to advance the mission of reforming the criminal justice system in Alameda County. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you. I want to talk about from a historical perspective, the evolution of criminal justice in California. And as I shared with our host, in planning this town hall, I have had a bird's eye seat, unfortunately, in the expansion of the prison industrial complex in California. My first understanding of the prison industrial complex and the inhumanity of incarceration in America is both my own juvenile experiences. I'm a survivor of the Ohio juvenile justice and foster care system. But I was blessed to go to Yale College. And in 1975, we hosted an event at the Yale Law School called Yale Attica Weekend for Life. And we brought to the Yale Law School the lawyers who were representing the prisoners and the families of those who suffered during the Attica State Prison uprising in New York State, which still stands today as the largest prison uprising in the history of the United States. And so I got to hear those stories firsthand and to see those lawyers standing in the gap for those families and for those who had suffered terribly and been the subject of the state assault upon the prisoners and those who were inside the prison on that day, terrible day of inhumanity. Then came to California and went to law school. And I want to kind of put this in context. California entered the Union in 1850. And it is ironic that in 1852, California legislature passed the California Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed enslaved and escaped slaves to be captured and returned to slavery anywhere in the United States, including California, because many people were brought to California as slaves and escaped. But under the legislation in 1852, we had our own Fugitive Slave Act. Not surprisingly, in 1852, California opened its first major state prison, San Quentin State Prison, which was built by prisoners. But now we have that institution, which remains, as many of us know today, open still, and houses California's death row. Fast forward from the 1850s to 1976, which we consider the modern era of criminal justice. And in 1976, California the legislature passed Senate Bill 42, which enacted something called determinate sentencing. And determinate sentencing has been recognized as the driver of the explosion in the California prison population. California prison population has increased 900% since 1976. And it's largely due to the determinate sentencing, which clearly said for the purpose of imprisonment in California for crime is punishment. There was no investment to be in rehabilitation and no thought about rehabilitation. I happen to have been admitted to practice law in California in 1983 and was honored to be able to participate from that point on as an advocate against the criminal justice system. I started my legal career in Bayview Hunters Point Community Defender's Office, representing people charged with crime in San Francisco. It was a federally funded program, one of the few in the country. Well, there were many at that time. It survived for many years, but ultimately federal funding was taken away for those kinds of programs. Ironically, I left Bayview Hunters Point in 1984. Between 1984 and 2005, California built 21 prisons. And I want to take you quickly through some of those significant developments. In 1984, we built CSP Solano. It was designed for 2,610 prisoners, and currently it holds 3,752 prisons. That prison at one point, and even today, is at 144% capacity. In 1986, we built CSP Sacramento, which was designed for some 1,800 prisoners, and then ultimately held over 2,300. So it stands at 129% capacity. 1987, we built Avenal State Prison, which was designed for 2,920 prisoners, and it currently holds 4,197 prisons. It's at 144%. Mule Creek State Prison was built in 1987. It was designed for 3,284 prisoners, and it currently holds 3,948 prisoners, 120% over capacity. Corcoran State Prison, many of you may have heard of this, is a super max prison. It was designed to hold 3,116 prisons. It currently holds 3,719 prisoners, so it's 114% over capacity. 1988, Chuckawalla State Prison was designed to hold 1,738 people. It currently holds 2,324 people. It's at 134% capacity. In 1989, Pelican Bay State Prison was opened. It includes 1,000 secured housing isolation cells. It was designed to hold 2,380 prisoners. It currently holds 2,608 prisoners, so it's at 110% capacity. In in my practice, I opened my own practice in 1991, and I was privileged to take 3 cases in that first year. One, sexual harassment, Polito versus CDC, a sexual harassment case on behalf of a female officer at San Quentin State Prison. Those first 3 cases were all at San Quentin. I then represented, in short order, Doug Hines, the chapter president for the officers union there, who took on the issue of racial disparities in discipline, pointing out that African American officers were being disciplined at significantly higher rates than white officers or Latino officers. And as a result, Doug Hines was set up to be killed inside San Quentin. So he almost paid with his life for having the audacity to both document it with the help of another Black officer, as well as then challenge the prison administration to do something about it. Ultimately, Doug was drummed out of the union for being a troublemaker. Then I also represented Lynn Atkinson. This was a retaliation case based on not her politics. She just did her job. She was the counselor who said that Geronimo Pratt was wrongfully imprisoned and was a political prisoner. And for that, she paid with her career. She investigated Geronimo Pratt's case, and she wrote a report as a correctional counselor and submitted the report that said Geronimo Pratt is a political prisoner and he should be released. I don't believe he committed the crime. That cost her her career and almost her life. So I was honored to represent those people who were employed within the California Department of Corrections, but who in their own way were standing up to make California a better place, who were fighting oppression on the inside, and they needed an advocate. That was the first of many cases. I spent the next 25 years suing the Department of Corrections. And I'll never forget the day that I took the deposition of one of the experts in one of my cases who had been hired and designated by the department as an expert. And as I listened to this man talk about his career within the Department of Corrections and the things that he had done in terms of designing prisons, and all the prisons, as he went through the list of all the prisons that he had designed and that he had helped open, and how proud he was, I literally had to take a break in the deposition, and I walked out of there feeling like I am in the room with Dr. Frankenstein, because this was the man who had created and fathered mass incarceration in California. In 1991, the same year that I opened my practice and started suing CDCR, we opened Wasco State Prison, which was designed for 2,984 people and currently holds 4,121 people. It's at 138% capacity. In 1994, California passed Proposition 184, the 3 strikes law, that doubled felony sentences and mandated 25-year to life sentences. And one thing we know that we learned from the 1976 determinate sentences, if you build prisons and you create mechanisms to incarcerate people, judges and district attorneys will fill the prisons. And that's exactly what happened. So when I talk about overcapacity, understand that what that means is that these prisons became instantly, and that's one of the things the gentleman in that deposition talked about. He talked about how they would build the prison he designed it for this many people, and within overnight, these prisons were overcrowded. That means you couldn't get medical care. You did not have, you were housed in a place that was significantly overburdened with a lack of services, a lack of housing, the kinds of things that ultimately become death sentences for people inside our prisons. In 1995, a watershed moment, Judge Stelton Henderson ruled in a case called Plata v. Brown that CDCR's medical care inside the prisons was unconstitutional, and he ordered the state prison medical system to go into receivership. The evidence that was put together by largely by the prison law office demonstrated clearly that in these overcrowded prisons, we were not providing medical care to people, and people were dying. That was a significant moment, but it took another 10 years for the state to actually, for the receivership to actually go into effect. And in that time, in 1994, we built Pleasant Valley State Prison, designed to hold 2,308 people, and it currently holds 3,062 people, 133% over capacity. Ironwood State Prison, designed to hold 2,200 people, but currently holds 3,203 people, 146% above capacity. High Desert State Prison, designed to hold 2,324 people and holds currently 3,286 people, 141% above capacity. Valley State Prison, designed to hold 1,980 people and currently holds 2,971 people, 150% above capacity. Salinas Valley State Prison, designed to hold 2,452 people and currently holds 2,877 people. It's 117% over capacity. And again, when you're talking about institutions, cells, iron, stone prisons that are over capacity, there's not enough staff, there's not enough services, there's not enough resources. I've been to many of these prisons. I've been to Mule Creek, I've been to High Desert, I've been to Corcoran and Pelican Bay. These places are cold, they're built in places, they're like stone cages. They look often from places like they're from the Stone Age. Pelican Bay is a hell of a place. I was forced to go inside because of one of my cases, and I went inside the control booth and I went inside the SHU unit. These places are terrible, and yet they're overwhelmed by the lack of resources. I mean, so just in and of themselves, they're terrible. But when you think about their over capacity from day one, they're not safe, they're not sterile. No, these are horrible places. And so the receivership that Judge Henderson ordered in 1994, 1995, CDCR fought that all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and it took 10 years. In 2003, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger renamed CDC to become CDCR. And before I leave the 1990s, understand the context in which California was building all of these prisons. You had the super predator mythology that was evoked nationally in the 1990s, approximately 1996. You had the Central Park Five, which epitomized the targeting of young Black children. So you had youth who were being prosecuted as adults across the state of California and sent to these horrible places. Okay, you had people that were receiving felony sentences and sentence enhancements, mandatory sentences, 3-strike sentences. All of that was happening. And those of us who watched it with horror just had no place to go with it. In 2006, California's prison population peaked at 173,000 people. The system was designed to house 85,000 people. So we were at 204% above capacity. Think about that. Think about that. Okay. Finally, in 2006, the receivership that Judge Henderson ordered in 1995 actually began. And medical care, there began a process of trying to make sure that medical care was being provided. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. It took another 5 years of CDCR appealing all the way to the United States Supreme Court before the United States Supreme Court in Brown versus Blatter declared that imprisonment in California was unconstitutional, that it violated the conditions of confinement, violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So in 2011, under the burden of litigation and lawyers, and finally court decisions finding our prison system, our entire prison system, unconstitutional, the legislature responded with AB 109, which began a process known as realignment, whereby under the statute, non-serious, non-violent, non-sex convictions and people convicted of those particular kinds of violations were sentenced to serve in their sentences in the county jails. As a result of realignment, the county jail budget, typically the sheriff's budgets throughout the state of California, they began to receive millions of dollars, and our county jail populations increased. And we weren't ready for it. And we have no control, no oversight over most county jail facilities. California has 56 county jails run by county sheriffs who are elected by the people and basically run every county sheriff runs his domain like a fiefdom, much like what I found with the prisons, that every warden considered himself the king, and he was the king, and everybody bowed down to the warden. And in every California county, everybody bows down to the sheriff. And in Alameda County, we saw the horrible, horrible administration of justice by our county sheriff. And in particular, Alameda County is a classic example of the failure of the criminal reform, justice reform movement that was ushered in, at least initially in 2011, by realignment. Last year, or in 2018, an Alameda County sheriff was charged with eavesdropping for illegally recording conversations between detained juveniles and their lawyers. The practice is suspected to have occurred with respect to adult conversations. So the right to counsel was being routinely violated in Alameda County Jail. Alameda County has one of the highest rates of inmate deaths in California. 35 people had died in Alameda County Jail in Santa Rita since 2014. 29 civil suits filed against the Alameda County Jail Administration, including a pregnant woman who was forced to give birth alone in a dirty cell while the deputies ignored her screams, and then suddenly the baby was born. Since 2015, the Alameda County Sheriff's Office has been sued and racked up more than $15 million in settlements and judgments in civil rights cases. So this is how we are now administering justice in California. The statutes have changed. We are on the cusp of huge realignment in terms of criminal justice reform. The problems exist, but in 2012, the voters of California passed Prop 36 to modify the three strikes law. In 2013, the prisoners at Pelican Bay began the longest hunger strike in protest of solitary confinement and isolation. In 2014, the voters passed Prop 47 to reduce felonies to misdemeanors. In 2016, we passed Prop 57 to mandate parole for nonviolent offenders and to limit the district attorney's ability to charge juveniles as adults. In Proposition 64, we legalized marijuana and gave the DA's authority to resentence or dismiss marijuana convictions. Proposition 2018 was a watershed year as well in criminal justice reform, passing of legislation to allow resentencing, to stop juvenile prosecution as adults by district attorneys, to eliminate enhancements, and to open up police files with SB 1421, which allows us now access to police records. CDCR currently houses 117 inmates in 35 prisons. It constitutes over 7% of our state budget. We still have much work to do, and much of the fight is now shifted to the counties. And so I urge everyone to look at what is happening in our county, with the sheriff's department, in the local facilities, as we continue the battle against incarceration in California. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
That was great. Wonderful history of California too.
Yes.
seeing exactly how everything stacks up and basically hurts everyone except for the powerful. All right, great. So let's go ahead and bring on our next speaker, Dr. Jody Armour. Dr. Armour is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. He has been a member of the faculty since 1995. Armour's expertise ranges from personal injury claims to claims about the relationship between racial justice, criminal justice, and the rule of law. Armour studies the intersection of race and legal decision-making, as well as torts and tort reform movements. He is the author of many books, one of which I cannot say on this screen. The list of all of his books are actually on the website for ourrevolutioneastbay.org/townhalls, and also going to be on the YouTube and Facebook pages for the video. Dr. Armour, are you unmuted and ready to go?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Great. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to launch in with really why my book has an unsayable title. It has the N word in it, N asterisk GGA theory. And I mean for that to have a bite to it, to have teeth in it, because it is what we've done with criminal justice for over 50 years, right? We've demonized, otherized, monsterized, and inwardized, all right? Black criminals in general, especially Black criminals. And one of the things that I'm trying to really drive home with this research, latest research, is unless we are able to fundamentally change our moral framework and our moral compass when it comes to criminals in general and Black criminals in particular, we're never going to be able to make deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration, right? That's the basic premise that I really kind of want us to keep considering and trying to drive home. One example, you know, these have been some outstanding histories in the folks who preceded me, and one of the things that you noticed is that there really was a time in this country when our conception of justice itself was about retribution, retaliation, and revenge, you know, and it was unabashedly so, unapologetically so. When I wrote my first book in 1997, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, I was talking about racialized mass incarceration. I was jumping up on tables and hollering about it. And the response I was getting was a big yawn from a lot of folks, or a talk to the hand from many others. And many of those people who were saying, talk to the hand, or all you're going to get in the way of a response from me when you tell me about racialized mass incarceration is a yawn. A lot of those people were Black people, and as well as non-Black folk, right? When you look at the polling data in the 90s, I used to always debate Randall Kennedy, a Black Harvard professor law. He was taking a more conservative stance than I was on these issues. But one fact that he was always able to point out, and I could not deny and refute whenever he did, was, and this was 97, 98, that polls they were doing in Black communities were saying that Black folk were saying at a 70%, 75% rate sometimes that they wanted more police, more jails, and more prisons, and longer sentences. All right, and poll after poll, and he would say, so you know, this is the community spirit speaking. This isn't just, you know, somebody like you trying to tell the community how they should be looking at crime and punishment. And you also, just to remember what those days were like and what's really at stake now, you know, the fact that we have to change the moral framework itself. Another very popular routine in the mid-90s that I partly named my book after was by Chris Rock, Bring the Pain. He goes back in front of an all-Black audience just about in Chocolate City at the time. This DVD used to be in just about every Black home I went in back in the mid-90s, late 90s. He went back and forth in front of this Black audience and says, it's like a civil war going on in Black America, and there's two sides. There's Black people and there's N-words. And N-words have got to go. I love Black people, but I hate N-words. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. Should I do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn? He goes on like that for 30 minutes distinguishing between lovable Black people and condemnable N-words. And his core definition of an N-word, by the way, when you go through his whole list and distill, a morally condemnable Black criminal. That's it, morally condemnable Black criminal, right? That's what you see coming out of it. And by that definition, and you know, the audience, by the way, was laughing, the whole, you know, this huge audience was amening, hunting, and preaching, you know, saying preach, you know, while he was saying all this and rolling in the aisles, making the butt of these jokes, Black criminals, right? And at the time he was even saying that, I put this in a recent article, and they said, Professor, this number sounds hyperbolic. We're gonna need a pinpoint site. So we got the pinpoint site. Up to 90% of the young Black males in some of these inner city neighborhoods are gonna wind up in jail, on probation, on parole at some point in their lives, and some of them, right? He was saying, and the audience was accepting the invitation to say that up to 90% of our own community are N-words, morally condemnable N-words that we're gonna otherize, distinguish and distance ourselves from, you know, accept the political invitation implicit in the punchline to distinguish between a morally condemnable them and an upright us, you know, wrap ourselves in the politics of respectability that represents, and that's really at the heart of that distinction. Bill Cosby was famous for that same way of thinking. Then now we're into the early 2000s, you know, moral frameworks. Bill Cosby, again, NAACP Image Award. He feels comfortable in 2004 to talk about, you know, his pound cake speech, saying, oh, people are upset about that Black kid getting shot over taking some pound cake, getting shot in the head over taking pound cake. Well, why did he take the pound cake? I've been hungry. I've looked in the window. I've seen pound cake. I didn't take it. You know why? Something called upbringing. That was the moral framework people were embracing in those times. And they're still out here, but we've seen a shifting in the Overton window. But I want us to remember what it was like not that long ago. You know, we get to 2012 and you start seeing some changes with the California voters. Thank God the voters lead the way with this. But for a long time, you had somebody like Jackie Lacey in LA County prosecuting an 18-year-old boy. This is in the mid-aughts, okay, 2000. Prosecuting an 18-year-old Black boy, goes into the back seat of an unoccupied car and takes a cell phone from it. Unoccupied car's back seat. And when he was 16, he had 2 purse snatching incidents. She got 25 to life, right? Didn't bat an eye when the judge, in a rare feat of judicial intervention, said, this shocks my judicial conscience. You know, after a couple of years, he sat on it. He said, I'm gonna try to knock it down to the 7 years you initially offered him. So she was, you know, this is part of the trial penalty. She objected and fought it and was support. That's how she became the #1 DA in LA County, because that was the morality, that was the moral compass, that was the moral framework that was driving criminal justice policy: retribution, retaliation, and revenge, right? That was the conception of justice that reigned. And every time there was a Megan's Law or a Jessica's Law, you could find some vulnerable victim that you could then publicize and say, Willie Horton style, let's make, you know, this a campaign for more draconian punishment, harsher, you know, sentences, right? So that's been the pattern. We know it's going to come again. We know it's coming, right? We know with the reforms that, you know, George Gascon and Chesa Boudin and Larry Krasner out in Philadelphia, they're doing the right thing. They're doing the only thing that makes sense, that's rational, that's right? But there's always going to be a risk of somebody doing something wrong. There's always a risk of error. There's always a risk of error. And what happens when in the Willie Horton case, for example, in Massachusetts, this is the 1988, just many people may already know this, 1988 presidential race between George Bush Sr. and George Dukakis, and rather Dukakis, Michael Dukakis. They're running against one another. Out comes a Willie Horton ad about a Black recidivist who was, that's how they characterize him, a Black recidivist who was on furlough. And while on furlough, a very humane program that had an over 99%, and I'm not exaggerating, well over 99% no incident rate, by the way, this program. He gets out, rapes a white woman, ties up her partner, and stabs him. And that torpedoed Michael Dukakis's campaign. every politician I saw started on the Democratic side as well as the Republican side, but especially the Democratic side now started running from the crime issue. Bill Clinton, 94 crime bill, Biden, the architect of mass incarceration. You know the story after that, right? That we've all kind of wrapped our arms around this retribution, retaliation, and revenge approach, and Black punishment, punishing Black people became political currency that you use to gain and hold office, right? The harsher, the better. And so remarkably, we've seen I time it around 2010, I started seeing a shift. I used to go to NAACP conferences and talk about civil rights issues, and they were hardly talking. They were talking a little bit about criminal justice. I'd be there with a few other people making a few noises at the table, but mainly the civil rights agenda in the 90s, 80s, 90s, and aughts. A lot. You go to these conferences, it'd be, affirmative action, workplace discrimination, housing discrimination, worthy causes all. But Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, helped a lot more people to recognize mass incarceration as a civil rights issue, not just an issue of bad people making bad choices, that none of us have any responsibility for, but a civil rights issue. Whoa. And so you really started seeing things like, 2012, Proposition 47, Proposition 57, marijuana legalization, the voters leading the politician, the voters with the propositions leading the politicians. They're getting out here and saying, we see the problem with what we've wrought. Even though we were leading the nation earlier with the 3 strikes law, we've seen the problem. So now the question is, and this is kind of where I kind of wrap it up now, for now anyway, is how do we maintain this shift in the moral framework that we've seen from retribution, retaliation, revenge to restoration, rehabilitation, and redemption, right? That's the move. And the new conception of justice that many are fighting for, and we have to really make work and make happen, is this shift from retribution, retaliation, revenge to restoration. What does that mean? And how do we do that? Rehabilitation, faith again in that, and redemption, recognizing the possibility for redemption. You see, and I'm going to look at, say, George Gascon's directives to his DAs here in LA. When I went through them, you could see this shift in the conception of justice right there in each directive, from retribution, retaliation, revenge, to this new moral compass, moral framework. Now, how do we make it stick? How do we reinforce this new moral framework while we have it? How do we support people like Chesa Boudin, like Larry Krasner, like George Gascon down here, and trying to get their DAs and many judges, and then I'll wrap up with this, recognize that many DAs that he's in a battle with now, George Gascon, he's in a battle now with all these DAs who are saying, oh, we don't want to follow these directives because we're not following the law, or that gives us too much discretion, or they're trying to fight back, and they're looking for any judge to help them fight back against these reforms. And why, may wonder, are they making it so personal? Because it is personal. What they are being told, and what a lot of judges are being told, by the way, is that your conception of justice, the one that you believed in, the one that you pursued zealously for 30, 40 years, tethered your personal identity to, as well as your professional identity. That conception of justice was wrong-headed, morally obtuse, and led to disaster. All right, and now we have a new conception of justice, all right? And we got to get on board with this. We look at people differently. We make moral judgments differently. We don't look at people just so much toxic human waste to be dumped somewhere. We're looking at people as people, with human frailties that make mistakes, but also that can be reformed, and et cetera, right? And they are finding that personally devastating. It is an existential threat to them, right? To have to deal with this kind of shift in the Overton window, right? And so that's what I'm hoping we can talk about some too, and getting to the next issue. I'm sorry if I ran on a little too long.
Oh no, that was perfect. You ended exactly on time, which is great. Thanks a lot, Dr. Armour. That was a wonderful history of the recent modern times that I'm very familiar with, and seeing basically everything you said, I remember happening. Yeah, so now we're going to have our final speaker, Chesa Boudin. I'm going to ask Kathy, my co-sponsor or co-host, to go ahead and introduce Chesa for us.
San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin is our final panelist. He was elected in November 2019 on a progressive platform centered on ending mass incarceration, protecting crime survivors, and addressing the root causes of crime. District Attorney Boudin personally understands the impact of incarceration. Both of his parents were incarcerated throughout his childhood, and his father is still in prison. I give you District Attorney Chesa Boudin.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you to our Revolution East Bay for bringing us together to talk about such critical issues. It's always an honor to speak alongside Professor Armour and with my friend Pamela Price. Great to see both of you, always inspirational to listen to your words and hear you speak truth about this system that has so shaped my life and tragically come to be a defining part of modern American culture. Let me take a step back and talk a little bit about how we got here, about the work that we've been doing in my office and where we're going as a country with this movement to radically rethink and re-envision our approach to crime and public safety and rehabilitation and restoration. You look at the history of crime and punishment in this country, it is tied in many ways inextricably to race and social control of people of color. You look at the rise of police departments way back in the day, and many of those police departments were privately funded to protect the wealth of the few against the needs of the many. And if you look at the expansion of criminal codes, it coincides throughout history with virtually every single moment when we've seen a mass uprising of people of color or otherwise socially excluded and oppressed people, whether it be the transition from slavery. And there are books, look, there are books that track this history brilliantly. Angela Davis has written about it. Michelle Alexander has written about it. You can read about it in Professor Armour's book. These histories are well documented. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details now, but suffice it to say, there is a line that you can follow easily and clearly from slavery all the way up until mass incarceration, what we see today. It is not an accident. It is not a coincidence that our jails and prisons from coast to coast are disproportionately filled with young men of color. Young men who could be getting their educations, who could be starting businesses, who could be raising families, right? But instead we have them in cages. Well, the way we got here, right? I mean, you can look at the growth. Pam was talking about the percentages of overcrowding in California prisons, for example. That wasn't true in the 1960s or the 1950s, right? It took off. The growth of our prison system in California and across the country took off at almost exactly the same time as the federal government and the state government and the local government was looking desperately for a mechanism to respond with force and with social control to the righteous rage that was being manifested in the form of the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement and all of the Brown Berets, all of the other groups of communities that had been historically disenfranchised and excluded economically and socially, red zoned out of housing opportunities and denied educational opportunity. Those groups that started to organize themselves politically in the 1960s and 70s, when the status quo, when the Republicans, when the law enforcement operatives saw what was happening, they said, we need a way to push back. And the way that they did it was with mass incarceration. And you see, if you look at a chart, I don't have a PowerPoint prepared for you, but if you look at a chart, you will see a line that goes like this, straight up, starting in the early 1980s. And there's a book by a man named Christian Parenti called Lockdown America, which you can read. He has the quotes from Nixon and Reagan and their administration saying, this is a great way for us to control these communities that are demanding their fair share, their voice in the political process. And that's when the war on drugs starts. That's when the war on drugs starts. And that's when we see people going to prison, not just for violent crimes, and look, let's be clear, violent crimes in this country are punished in ways that are absolutely inhumane. Violent crimes are punished in ways that no other civilized country in the history of the world chooses to punish people for, right? But we also saw this explosive growth. And I'll tell you, some of the people that were in prison with my mom and my dad for decades were there for drugs, for possession of drugs with intent to distribute, decades. And in a minute, I'm gonna talk about the work we're doing to unwind and to reimagine and reinvent our approach to public safety. But I want to point out something really important. As folks like myself or George Gascon or Larry Krasner or Rachel Rollins or Kim Fox or any of these other folks around the country who are part of our national movement to radically re-envision criminal justice, as we start to do things differently. And when I say different, let me be really clear about what I mean. The status quo approach is, let's send people away for as long as possible every chance we get. Let's max them out. Let's seek the maximum punishment, the death penalty, life without parole, 25 to life for a purse snatching, you name it. That is the status quo approach. That is what led us to mass incarceration. That is what led not just to my parents being incarcerated. My parents participated in a very serious crime. 3 men were killed. But my parents are not the average prisoner, right? The average prisoner is there for something in which nobody got physically hurt. That's the average prisoner serving decades. We as a society have been willing to spend $80,000, $90,000 a year to incarcerate people. Where is that investment in communities, in education, in healthcare, in job training, right? We know what builds safe communities. It's prevention, right? Instead, we wait for people to do something wrong and then we hit them as hard as we can. And we set them up to fail again and again and to make sure you can't be a barber if you have a felony conviction in California. You can't be a firefighter if you have a felony conviction in California. You can't get any kind of jobs or educational loans or any of the things you need to do right. And then we wonder why we have recidivism rates at which people are released from custody and reincarcerated across the country that are above 2/3. It's a revolving door and it's set up to be that way. Less than 2% of the entire multi-billion-dollar budget of the Department of Corrections in the state of California, less than 2% goes to rehabilitative programs. We're not trying to rehabilitate people. We're trying to warehouse them. And it's no wonder that it hasn't worked to make us safer. But nobody ever said to those traditional tough on crime prosecutors, show us the data, show us the empirical evidence that this approach works, right? In other words, if we're going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in a war on drugs, which we have in this country, fumigating peasant crops in Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, right? Policing, dogs getting trained to sniff, building jails and prisons, training correctional officers, expanding and militarizing our police forces so that they can over-police poor Black and brown neighborhoods. And by the way, I went to Yale College and Yale Law School, and you didn't see the police kicking down doors in the dorm room when people were using illegal drugs, right? They were on the other side of the city making arrests in Black and brown neighborhoods for drugs, right? We have a total double standard when it comes to enforcement of these laws, right? But nobody ever said, well, show us the evidence, the data that putting someone in a cage for possessing small amounts of organic plant material like marijuana is an effective way to achieve any legitimate government interest. I mean, let's talk about what those interests might be. You might say, well, people harm themselves when they use drugs. They overdose, they die, right? We want to prevent people from using drugs. Okay, show me the evidence that putting people in cages makes it less likely that other people are going to use drugs. Because I haven't seen any evidence of that. Okay, you might say, well, this is illegal, it's a crime, they're not paying taxes on their money, and the government wants to tax all economic activity. Okay, show me the evidence that the war on drugs has decreased the number of people selling drugs. You might say, well, we want to drive the price up so it's harder for people to get addicted in the first place. Show me the evidence that the war on drugs has made access to drugs or the cost of drugs more difficult. It doesn't exist. And nobody ever asked those tough on crime prosecutors, those drug warriors, to come up with empirical evidence. Now you have people like me and Larry Krasner and others we've mentioned around the country saying, wait a second, this approach, this use of resources is backwards. We need to put the money up front in our communities. We need to put victims at the center of the process and invest in healing crime victims and supporting people who've been harmed, not simply use them as pieces of evidence that we drag into court and compel in many cases to give testimony, even if they don't want to. We need to start thinking about restorative justice, which is a victim-centered, victim-driven approach to responding to crime and to healing people who've been harmed and to holding those that caused the harm accountable. And all of a sudden, everybody wants data. All of a sudden, people say, well, let me see that this works. And we should believe, let me be clear, we're going to show them that it works. We've got the data. We've been doing restorative justice in San Francisco's juvenile system for 5 years now, and over 90% of victims contacted say that's what they prefer. They prefer a restorative justice approach to an approach that just sends a kid to a warehouse for X number of years, right? Puts them in cages. That's what victims want. And it's not just that it's what victims want. It's that it's what makes us safer as a community. The recidivism rate, the rate at which these young people are rearrested when they go through a restorative justice process instead of a traditional lock them up and throw away the key process, is drastically lower. It's drastically lower. In other words, people are set up to succeed when we hold them accountable instead of simply punishing them. It's a huge difference. Our system does a great job of punishing people. It does a terrible job of holding them accountable. Now, I want to talk briefly about a couple of the things we've been able to do in San Francisco in the year since I got elected, because these are things that I campaigned on. These are things that our revolution and Senator Bernie Sanders endorsed me and helped me win my election because of my commitment to do. And I am really proud to say that despite historic obstacles like COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter social justice uprising this summer, all of the things that really rose up in 2020 in a way we never could have anticipated, right? Shutting down our courts, changing crime trends, devastating local government budgets, we've still been able to push forward and make changes that are long overdue. So let me give you a few of the things we've done. I ran my campaign with a central commitment that we would end mass incarceration, that we would cease to use jails and prisons as a primary response to all of the social problems we see, right? That it would be a last resort rather than a first resort. And I'm proud to tell you that in just a year in office, we have decreased the number of people in California Department of Corrections out of San Francisco County, right? The people that my office is responsible for, by over 25%. I'm proud to tell you that our county jail, it's not just that we're holding them all in the jail. It's not just that we're holding them all in the jail. Our county jail population in San Francisco fell from its peak in the month after I took office to its lowest point. It fell by over 45%, right? We've drastically decreased our jail and prison population. And a lot of people, right, the fear mongers, the folks who want to focus on the crimes that do happen, because we live in a society with crime, with inequality, with access to weapons, with trauma, right, with untreated mental illness and addiction. We know that. We know there's going to be crime. And the fear mongers will tell you, well, if you let them out of the jail, if you let them out of the prison, what's going to happen? Crime's going to go way up. Well, we saw the opposite happen in San Francisco this year. We saw crime in my first year in office fall by 23% compared to the prior year. And a lot of people will tell you, well, that's because of the pandemic. And that's true. I'm not taking credit for it. I want to be clear. I know the pandemic changed everything about our daily lives, including crime trends. But what I also know is we showed in 2020 that we can safely decarcerate, that we can reduce our expensive, inhumane reliance on putting human beings in cages and focus resources on successful reentry, on community-based services and programming, and on effective prevention and deterrence. And we can do it in a way that is consistent with our values as progressives in San Francisco and the Bay Area. We can do it in a way that's consistent with our values of members of our revolution, of people who supported Senator Bernie Sanders, and of people who understand that hurt people hurt people. And when we heal the hurt, we're all safer as a result. And that's where we should be focusing our resources. We should get the vindictive and punitive aspects of our system out, focus on accountability and equal enforcement of the law. So let me tell you a couple other things we did, and then I'll wrap up because I know folks have questions and I've been talking a long time. We ended money bail. We ended money bail. Let me tell you what money bail is. Money bail is a wealth-based system for keeping people incarcerated, even when they haven't been convicted of a crime, simply because they are too poor to come up with a cash payment. It means wealthy people, no matter how dangerous they are, get released from custody immediately And poor people, no matter how low risk they may be, no matter how petty the crime they were arrested for is, languish behind bars simply because of their poverty. Well, we replace that wealth-based system with a risk-based system. It gives meaning to the promise of equal protection under law, and it promotes public safety for all of us. We also ended the racist use of the kind of sentencing enhancements that Professor Armour was talking about that were commonplace across the state, huge drivers of racial disparities in sentencing and of mass incarceration. We just said we're not going to use 3 strikes or racist gang enhancements. And we also said we're not going to be complicit in policing that amounts to driving while black or brown, right? We've heard about that. We know anybody on this call who's black or brown, you've been stopped. You've been stopped just because of the way you look. I see people nodding your heads. I see you. That's not right. That is not right. We should not live in a society where our law enforcement officials with a badge and a gun and a uniform are stopping people while they're driving down the street simply because of the color of their skin, and yet it happens every day in every city across the country. Well, I said, not on my watch. I will not be complicit. The district attorney's office will not be complicit with this massive, decades-long, systematic civil rights violation that undermines trust between communities of color and the law enforcement agencies that have sworn to serve and protect those same communities. And so we implemented a policy, and I'm proud to say Professor Armour was there with me when we announced it back in February, a year ago. He was there with me when we announced it at Manny's in the Mission in San Francisco, where we said, if police officers stop someone for driving while black or brown, if it's a pretextual traffic stop, we will not file contraband criminal charges stemming from those stops and searches. We're going to push the police department to live up to the values and the standards that we all deserve and expect from them. And that means equal enforcement when police break the law too. And that's why we filed on my watch the first ever homicide charges against a San Francisco police department officer who was on duty and shot and killed an unarmed black man. His name was Cato O'Neill. And it happened 3 years before I was elected, but we filed the case, and it's one of 3 cases we filed since I took office against police officers. I want to be clear, I don't have anything against police officers. I have tremendous respect for the hard work that men and women in the police force do every day. It is a difficult job. Is a very difficult job, and we depend on police for a lot of critical public safety functions. But I also want to be clear, for far too long, police have operated with total impunity and without any transparency. And it is high time that we have district attorneys who are willing to enforce the law equally. And that means if we see someone commit a crime, whether it's a police officer, whether it's a random person walking down the street, we need to approach it the same way. We need to hold police to a high standard. We give them tremendous power and authority. We give them tremendous trust and responsibility. And it means if they violate that trust, if they use force unlawfully, we will hold them accountable. Now, there's a lot of folks that don't like that. A lot of folks in the police unions that don't like being held accountable. A lot of folks in the tough on crime media circles that don't like that. And so what they do is they look at any example of a crime, of a tragedy that occurred. And we've had some in San Francisco. Of course, we've had some. This is a tragic year. People are living in isolation and desperation, and economic opportunities have evaporated overnight for so many folks who've lost their jobs and their homes and their shelter beds. So of course, there have been violent crimes this year. And what they do is they try to exploit those tragedies and use them as opportunities to fearmonger, to blow racist dog whistles, to bring out tropes like Willie Horton, like Professor Armour talked about, and to roll back criminal justice reforms rooted in data, in empirical evidence, and in racial justice. But our movement is too strong for that. Our confidence and our commitment to our values and to our principles of equal enforcement of the law and racial justice are way too deeply ingrained in our bones to fall prey to the kinds of lies and fear-mongering that we see coming out of some of these places every day. We will not fall, we will not falter, and we will not stop in our pursuit for a more just, equitable, and efficient approach to the problems like drug addiction and mental health and trauma that are at the root of so many crimes that get committed. We know we can do better, and we will do better together because our movement is growing, and it's growing every day. Thank you so much for your support, for your work, for your vision, for your leadership, and for having the backs of all the folks out there on the front lines doing the difficult work to reinvent and reimagine our approach to public safety. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. That was the end of our speakers section of the talk, and there was so much knowledge dropped. I don't know how many questions everyone has. I have like 4 or 5 myself. And also that stat about $90,000 per year per prisoner. Isn't Stanford like $30,000? Like, oh, it looks like you're muted.
Yeah, it depends which department. I think Stanford's raised its prices, but it is definitely cheaper to send someone to Stanford or Harvard or Yale or Cal than it is to hold them in a cage. And the problem is we're only willing to spend the money after they get arrested for a crime. We're not willing to invest that money up front in education and job training.
Yeah, and we don't have to send someone to Stanford for 25 years.
That's right. That's right.
4 to 8 is great. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and get on with the Q&A panel section of the talk. For those of you watching on YouTube and Facebook, please drop your questions in the chats for Facebook and YouTube, and we'll be collecting them up and asking them during the second part of the question and answer period. For the first part, if anyone has any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand. It looks like we have Barisha. You already have a question? You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I want to thank this panel. This was absolutely excellent. This has been great. Thank you, Pamela Price, Chesa, Boudin. I'm so glad you were elected. And I was a criminal justice major at San Francisco State University. And we were talking about this history and this policy during my time there. So I'm super proud. It was a super left progressive program. And my question is, how do we get an independent police oversight commission in Alameda County, similar to what's happened in Oakland? I know Assembly Bill 1185 was presented to the legislature. The purpose of the bill was to authorize the county to establish a sheriff oversight board, either by action of the Board of Supervisors or through a vote of county residents. And the bill would authorize sheriff oversight to issue a subpoena when deemed necessary to investigate a matter within the jurisdiction of the board. The bill would have authorized the county to establish office of the Inspector General to assist with the board in its supervisional duties. Now that bill did not pass. It was placed in inactive status. But is there another way to go about establishing an oversight commission for Alameda County, over the Alameda County Sheriff?
Is that directed at any of the speakers or just anyone in general?
Anyone who would like to answer the question.
Sure.
Sure, I'll start since I'm in Alameda County and hopefully bringing some policies and some change to Alameda County. And I think, thank you, Barisha, for that summary of the legislation. And it is unfortunate that some of the most forward thinking and basic protections that we try to get through the California legislature don't always happen. So the way to do it in Alameda County would be to do a countywide ordinance that we could model after the legislation, and we'd have to actually campaign and get it passed throughout the county. As you know, our Board of Supervisors has consistently abdicated their responsibility, their any ability to oversee the sheriff, even refusing to audit his budget, and turning a blind eye to the lawsuits and turning a blind eye to the deaths that we see inside Santa Rita County Jail. So as Chesa pointed out, it's the residents of California that have led the way, and it will have to be the residents of Alameda County that lead the way towards accountability for the sheriff. So thank you for the question.
Any other speakers want to answer that question?
Yeah, let's Gus Newport.
I might.
Oh, sorry,
me?
guys. Yeah, sorry, we have, were you gonna answer the question for the speakers, or do you want to ask a question?
I was just going to respond to the question.
Oh, okay, great, yeah.
No, I agree absolutely with Pamela Price. It's going to have to be a ballot initiative that's written out correctly with the kinds of language to make the necessary corrections. The problem with that is on these COVID times, it'd be very difficult. But even when there's a freedom to move around, people don't really get involved in the process and get out to vote and educate people. I'm so thankful for the 4 panelists, the information you brought. I was on the 2nd Police Review Commission in the history of this country. I grew up in Rochester, New York, a city that had 2 police riots in the 60s. And we passed one of the first federal decrees of a federal court in police. I worked with Malcolm X to develop the Organization of Afro-American Unity. I came through other things, but even when I was in Mayor Berkeley, it was right after Prop 13 got passed. And we knew when we looked at the police department, the budget was 60%. We reorganized our police department, but I had to call on national organizations to come. And we happen to think that because we're so-called from a progressive place, black, white, whatever else, that we got all the answers. But I can tell you, I now live in Oakland. I'm on the Reimaging Commission. Oakland is as screwed up as any place in the world. You got the Reimaging Commission, you got a Police Review Commission, you got the Department of Violence, and all this. All these things are individualized. There's no system of sorts. We don't have the depth of information, which some of you got to us, and to inform us what to do. So we think things are getting better. Oakland's been under a decree from the federal government, Felton Henderson, for 17 years, and nothing's cracked up. The police department in Oakland was founded during the Republican days before Lionel Wilson was elected, when you went down and we brought white supremacists from Mississippi and places like that during that step. People don't understand the history. You can't correct things without knowing the history in order to inform the policies and this and that. So I am so glad for the speakers that we had, and we need more of that to assist us.
Yes, we definitely do. Knowledge is always very useful. Antoine, I think I saw your hand up next.
If I can make a comment, I
Oh.
agree with what I've heard from the responses of Mayor Newport and Attorney Price. And we also need to consider who should be our next sheriff in Alameda County. Thank you.
Yes, I just want to thank the panelists, Chesa, Pam, a lot of people on this panelist. I'm from Contra Costa County, and I see Gail McLaughlin and my brother Williams on the other line. Our sheriff is trying to open up another prison and take and I also sit on the board of alcohol and other drugs for the last 10 years for the county. And I'm the founder of Men and Women of Purpose, the first Black reentry program that went into the Contra Costa County correction facility and brought programs inside out. So I know firsthand on what I'm a reentry professional expert, or however you want to call it. And if you have a problem if you have a solution to the problem, you're a problem to the money. And some of these individuals don't want to see people get well because that's how they get paid because they're sick. And what I found out is that our people suffer through real vicarious trauma, and the war on drugs did a whole ripple effect for 35 years to the Black community that people don't even understand. I am a product and I survived it, so I know firsthand. So I'm not just talking about some book work. I'm talking about lived experience. And so going into the jails and dealing with the population that a lot of individuals that I know, their family members, and dealing with them with the domestic violence, anger management, these things that they really needed. The substance abuse was on the #1 tilt of everybody else, of all the individuals' crimes. It was substance abuse, then mental health sometimes, most of the time. But kind of both of them sitting on the board while I said it, it's like they 50-50. Mental health and substance abuse come hand in hand. So they don't get their medication, they self-medicate. But doing the work that I've done and listening to y'all, on this panel, man, it's like for me, I'm still doing the work. I'm still going on reentry forums and speak and do my part politically to change these things, and also with my board. But this is to Gail and Mr. Willis that's on this phone. I really hope that you don't support the jail expansion and do everything to help me not to have that expansion open up at West County Jail, because we need that money outside services in our community. There's no reason a person has to be incarcerated to get mental health and substance abuse services. So if anybody else can chime in on, on what I've said, I really appreciate it, because like I said, I've been doing this work, and in these areas, those what you have to focus on with the assessments that is being done on these participants. I don't call them inmates, I call them participants, because they participate in their success so they can get a second chance at a first-class life. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I think, Gail, you were up next, so you can ask a question and answer Antoine too. All right, can you unmute yourself? Let's see.
Okay, hi. Yes, first of all, just to answer Antoine's question, I most definitely oppose the expansion of the prison. I mean, it's ridiculous that we should even have to fight this, but we do, and we will, and we'll build that movement. We built movements to oppose expansions of prisons in the past, and we'll do it again. So thank you to East Bay, Our Revolution, for all your work, and thank you to all the wonderful speakers. So much of what you spoke to intersects with the work that we have done. And well, first of all, it intersects with the problems that developed in Richmond, the history, and also so many of the solutions that we have been able to put forward in terms of reentry programs, but also more solutions that we're working on. So I'm a Richmond City Council member and the former mayor of Richmond, and I'm pleased to be on here with all of you. And I have a question for San Francisco DA Chesa Boudin. It's great to see you again, Chesa. And here's my question. I know back in September 2020, you and others founded the Prosecutors Alliance of California, which is a progressive prosecutors alliance and the first in the nation of this kind of alliance. And I know the founders of this alliance included yourself and Contra Costa DA Diana Becton and LA DA George Gascon and San Joaquin County DA Tori Verber Salazar. So can you share some of the goals of this alliance? And I know a little bit about Assembly Member Banta's bill to cure conflict of interest among prosecutors who take police union money. So can you talk a bit about that, as well as some of the overall goals of the alliance?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, Gail, and for your leadership and work. It's been great to see you and to work with you from across the Bay. Always a pleasure. I also, want to, and this dovetails with your question, Gail, but I want to go back to a point one of the previous speakers made. In San Francisco, we were talking about mental health and drug addiction in a previous comment. In San Francisco County Jail, 75% of people booked into the jail are drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. And the jail has become the #1 provider of behavioral health services in the city, more than the hospital, more than any other place. And so to your question, Gail, about what we're trying to do with the Prosecutors Alliance, we're trying to do a couple things. I mean, one thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we are a voice for law enforcement leadership advocating for treatment on demand, for safe consumption sites, for behavioral health treatment, not in cages, but with care in the community. And that means a number of things. It means lobbying in Sacramento. And look, we know that the California District Attorneys Association for decades has been a loud and aggressive voice for mass incarceration, for policies that have racially disparate impacts, that starve local communities of investments in areas that can actually prevent crime and keep families together and communities strong. And I want to be clear, I am a member of California District Attorneys Association as an elected DA. And I talk to the other people in that organization and I lobby them to try and make changes, but I'm in the minority. The bulk of the folks in that association are out here advocating for 3 strikes, advocating for money bail, advocating for increasing the number of felonies that are on the books. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a association that believed in reform and that had the credibility and the experience of having implemented policies that promoted public safety without simply turning to incarceration. And so we engage in a number of things. You mentioned one of them, which is Rob Bonta's bill. We came up with an issue, something I initiated in partnership with the other DAs you mentioned, and we call it curing the conflict of interest. And what that means is we want district attorneys and district attorney candidates to be prohibited from accepting campaign donations from police unions. And I want to be clear, this is not about saying police unions, are denied their First Amendment rights, or they can't, have a voice or vote or even spend political money. It has nothing to do with that. This is about a very narrow, specific issue, which is that if I am the district attorney of any county in this state, at some point during my 4-year term, I will be asked to investigate an officer's use of force or allegation of perjury or what have you. And that officer will belong to a union that more often than not will have made major contributions to my campaign. If it's not an actual conflict, it sure as heck is the appearance of a conflict, and the law has no room for that kind of thing. And so we asked the state bar and we asked the assembly to pass a law prohibiting the candidate. It has nothing to do with the union. It's about the candidate. If you want to be a candidate for office like this one, the one that I'm privileged to hold, you should agree to, you have to work closely with the police, but you have to be independent of them as well. And that means no political contributions directly from police unions. The other members of CDAA all oppose that. That's an area where CDAA said, no, we want to keep taking money from police. It doesn't create a conflict. It doesn't create a conflict, they said. And then you look at you look at the impunity, you look at the fact that throughout this country, almost every single elected district attorney has received money from police unions and has refused to prosecute cases like Ahmaud Arbery or like George Floyd. How much political pressure did it take before they filed those charges in George Floyd's case? It took a national, international uprising of righteous rage just to get them to do their dang job. Well, we've got to cure that conflict of interest. Those are some of the things we're doing in Prosecutors Alliance, Gail.
Thank you.
Okay, Melvin, looks like you're up next.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists. That was actually very informative. And actually to Antoine's question, no, I do not support the jail expansion. Actually, in 2017, we signed a letter from the city of Richmond, all of us, stating that we didn't support the jail expansion. And actually tune into the County Board of Supervisors meeting this Tuesday because they're talking about Measure X money, which is $90 million. And the goal is to keep that away from the Sheriff's Department because he already has way too much money in his budget. So yeah, my name's Melvin Willis. I'm a member of the Richmond City Council, reelected, and organizer with ACE, Racial Justice Coalition. I'm part of the RPA as well. And I guess I actually had a couple of questions from the great presentation that I had, and any way you look at it, it could be chopped up in two different ways. I guess the first question I have is because of COVID-19, and there's been a huge push on early release for those who are actually eligible for early release. And I know depending on your jurisdiction, there's monitoring happening. What are we doing seeing past this pandemic to make sure that we're not just perpetuating the criminal justice system by not just locking up everybody who was eligible for early release, but finding other programs to get them out of the criminal justice system? What kind of strategy or policy could be adopted? And also to, the professors and the folks that really broke down the history of criminalization, redlining, and slavery in this community, the Black community. I guess my question is what would be your advice at starting that narrative shift, as me being somebody who's African descent, but also talking to somebody who also grew up in the hood, but made it out and has a more tough on crime approach? How do we change that narrative and saying that poverty is more likely going to put you in a criminal justice system rather than just committing a crime? And thank you again for the presentation. It was great.
And just briefly say, we have a history, and this is a history deeply intertwined with the rise of punishment and the punishment state that we've talked about, of criminalizing poverty. And so to your point, I mean, that's exactly what we see. That's things like money bail that I'm proud to say we've ended in San Francisco. It's all about criminalizing poverty. the political pressure to prosecute people for being unhoused. Let me tell you, I was on the campaign trail in 2019, right? And the single most common question that I got as a district attorney candidate was, what are you going to do about the homeless? And, it's like, well, the city of San Francisco has a Department of Homelessness. They've got a $300 million budget. Why don't we ask them that question? We got to create housing for the homeless. That's what we got to do. We got to get people off the street and on their feet. That's what we got to do. Why would that be a question that people address to a law enforcement official? Why? It's not a crime to be poor. It's not a crime to be unhoused. It's not a crime to have nowhere to sleep other than a tent you set up somewhere. It's just not. It's not a crime, and I'm not going to prosecute it. But we have a system and we have a mentality and we have a culture that in many instances, especially people who are privileged and entitled, people who are wealthy, who say, I don't even want to see poverty. It makes me uncomfortable. It makes me feel unsafe. And my response is to call the police. And what we've seen in San Francisco is that when we created a non-emergency police hotline so that people who had issues with tent encampments or with unhoused individuals in our community wanted to reach out to the city and ask for, whether it be, cleaning services on the streets, because sometimes people don't have access to public toilets, what have you, that when the city sent anybody other than police, a lot of folks were unhappy. They wanted police to come and respond. And so they started changing the nature of the reports that they were making. They started saying they were seeing violent behavior. In many instances, no evidence. Video footage would show just invented, right? There is a desire by many people to have poverty just washed away without doing the work of helping to lift people out of poverty, without paying the taxes needed to invest in infrastructure or community services or training, right? So to your question, Melvin, absolutely, the problems of poverty and mass incarceration are deeply intertwined. And it's not just that we lock up poor people across the country. It's that locking people up throws their families into poverty, right? You send young men to prison, and who's paying the bills? Who's keeping the lights on? Who's helping to put kids into school? Who's earning the money? Then you got single mothers or single fathers at home. And that dooms an entire next generation to poverty and puts them at greater risk of being over-policed and incarcerated themselves. We've got to break the cycle.
Great. Dr. Ware, did you give any thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in briefly on the last part of the question about the response from our community, and it connects to what Brother Chesa had said about breaking the cycle. So my father was a locksmith with a 6th grade education, who was homeless for almost 30 years of his life as he was slowly drinking himself to death. And when I was a kid in DC, walking around with my nose in a book, I was accused of acting white. Okay. The culture that we are embedded in is one that needs transformation. And some of the resources that are going towards incarceration need to be moving towards efforts that are actually going to revolutionize the culture through changes in the way that we understand our position in it. I'll give you an example in a concrete way of what I'm talking about. I'm involved with a program at UCSB called the Underground Scholars Program, which is a program for formerly incarcerated students who are enrolled at UCSB. And we do every other Friday a program called Freedom Writers, okay? WRITERS, looking at all the ways in which the documentary practices of this carceral state have taken away our freedom at one level or another, with pieces of paper that were written down by judges or by slave purchasers, and trying to empower us to use writing practices to take our freedom back, to liberate ourselves. Those kinds of programs have no money in them. I literally fund parts of the programming with my own personal research account as a professor, because there's no budget for that. There's no cultural imperative that says that we need to be shaping knowledge practices in our own community that allow us to be thriving, successful, and responsible for our own lives. Some of us have to literally just invent that out of scratch while our families are ripped apart. While we're getting stopped 17 times in my 17th year by the police for driving while Black. Never ticketed. So that's where these resources need to be going, but we also need to understand that we can't wait for the politicians to do it. We have to take actions at every level throughout the community, throughout the culture, and it has to be a wide-ranging effort to kind of reclaim a different sense of personhood than the kind of personhood that is being constructed for us by the carceral state.
Yeah, Gus Newport, I would like to respond to what the doctor just said. The United States is 43rd in the world in illiteracy and education, 72nd in the world in healthcare. When we reorganized the police department in Berkeley, we recognized that we had to bring in mental health workers to help people who were homeless because Reagan had closed the mental health institutions. But we also recognized that we had to provide money that we were cutting from the police department to provide through nonprofits and whatever to help was upgrading the quality of education, job creation, and all those things. There used to be a time when the American cities had to create a general plan or a master plan every 5 to 20 years. You find me a city that has a master plan or a general plan that's created one in the last 30, 40, or 50 years. This doesn't exist anymore. You got city manager, former governments, this and that, but you can't have an operating system that's functional to raise the quality of life for all unless you got systems integrated, and that's planning, public works, transportation, education, all those kinds of things. And if we don't begin to go towards that, we're in a world of trouble, because I've been getting calls because I was a Martin Luther King fellow at MIT for a couple of years, and they've been calling me because of a project I did in Boston, talking about post this pandemic, we're going to have to reorganize all cities anyway. I mean, people who live in the suburbs who now come into the cities or who move into these market rate condos are not coming into those because they can virally participate through their work and such whatever else. So you got all these market rate condos going up downtown Berkeley and Oakland and other places, Richmond. You could make those into affordable housing, put solar panels on the roofs so that we could create energy in this net, put more money into our education system. The so-called great liberal University of California at Berkeley was getting ready to bust the Institute for Social Justice that was founded by Troy Duster, the grandson of Ida B. Wells. If it had not been for that institute that Troy did, that has educated so many people of color, especially Black PhDs and whatever else, I wouldn't have been able to get some of the public policy I did when I was married. He worked hand in hand with us instead. People, we got to open our eyes and grow. Smell the air. Recreate the economy. Develop a better environmental system so that there will be a future for the next generation, et cetera, whatever else. And I'll tell you, nothing could be better than helping those of us. I got out of politics. I got drafted. 8 years, Berkeley, the so-called most progressive place in the world. When I looked at the combination of white supremacists and neoliberals and all that bullshit, I said, let me get out of here. Politics to me was a sickening thing. I ain't gonna tell you some stories about some who are supposed to be so progressive, you know, in these places or whatever else, because if I do, they say, oh my God, Gus, why'd you reveal that? But I want you to know the truth. Thank you all for the information you gave and this and that. And we have to do this more often to really rebuild the city. Because I'll tell you, the politicians by themselves ain't got it. They don't have the capacity.
No, they do not. That's why we put these on, because we know they need the information, because we can watch them and see how badly they do.
Exactly. Could I
Dr.
jump in
Armour?
just?
Oh, I was going to, yeah, go ahead, Pamela.
I just want to jump in.
Real quick, Pam, I just need to jump off. I'm so sorry. I love the work you all are doing. It's great to see you. Have a great night. Stay safe. And Pam, always a pleasure. Jody, great to see you. Thank you all for the work. Stay strong.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Chesa.
Thank you, Chesa. Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on a point that Chesa made, and it's so important to recognize that we have absolutely criminalized poverty, and that is where we have to take what Dr. Armour talked about. I love that, the new moral conception. And we got to tell people, no, why are you asking me about what I'm going to do about homelessness? I'm not the mayor, okay? That's not my responsibility. I'm going to try to make sure homeless people do not end up in the criminal justice system and that I'm not incarcerating them. Hello, that's really what it's about. And to your point, it is so critical to Gus's point and the point that's made, the politicians are very limited. We've had, I talked about briefly the watershed legislation that was passed in 2018, but there were two things that did not pass that to me are so critical. One was in 2019, the California legislature refused to pass SB 144, which would have eliminated adult fines and fees in criminal courts, because we fundamentally criminalize poverty. We make people who are caught up in the criminal justice system pay for that system, and we disrupt the economic stability of Black and brown communities through the criminal justice system. And so that legislation did not pass. Another piece of legislation which did pass, but which was vetoed in 2020 by the governor, was SB 369, which would have established a reentry commission and made services for returning citizens a priority in this budget, a priority in the administration of criminal justice. And that bill was vetoed, as if, and the statement was that, oh, it's not really necessary. We don't really need that. Well, we do, because what the brother talked about is that how many of the reentry programs are being financed by individuals and by nonprofits. And the people who are getting millions of dollars through the state budget for incarceration are not spending and prioritizing reentry at all. And that has to change. So we have to push the politicians, and beyond what the politicians are willing to do, we've got to create at every level a powerful movement. And I look forward to our revolution taking this on, that we will talk about and change the whole idea that that is appropriate for us to criminalize and financially prey upon people in the criminal justice system.
Most definitely. We're going to do a little switch up here because Dr. Ware has to go soon. And so there's a very interesting audience question. So I want to jump to that. And then we're going to go back to and get Dr. Armour's insights for the last question, because we didn't get to hear that and I wanted to hear that also. For Dr. Ware, from Michael, if the early slaves with abolitionist instinct thoughts were allowed to flourish, what do you think this society would look like today? For me, I guess it would be Wakanda, but that was just me.
Jay coming with the heat. No, that's it's a beautiful question. The truth is that we had actually a partial answer to that. The partial answer to that was Saint-Domingue, Haiti. Which in its early years, what the first free republic in the Western Hemisphere, many of the leaders of that, and the first one to abolish the institution of slavery here in the Western Hemisphere. 1791, this happened, and you see the beginnings of a free and flourishing economy. Also, a very powerful state in the works that is able to defeat the French army, which is the most powerful imperial force on the planet at that point in time. Because of those enslaved Africans earning their freedom, they ended the imperial designs of France, which led directly to the Louisiana Purchase. That's what allowed Jefferson to buy it cheap, was that the French basically had to sell off their interest. And so one of the things that I tell California students right off the top is that when y'all are partying in Isla Vista, pour some out for those Africans that got you California. By refusing to submit to slavery and struggling for their freedom. But how did Jefferson, who made that Louisiana Purchase, repay those enslaved Africans who gave him his most signal accomplishment of his presidency? With an embargo that turned it into the most impoverished nation in the Western Hemisphere within a 30-year period. So the issue is that even had we been able to get our freedom and continue along those kinds of trajectories, the broader systems of white supremacy, the broader systems of racial and economic marginalization were still coming to bear on us. That's why we're still engaged in this struggle today. And that's why we have to perceive this as the continuation of that struggle against white supremacy, against the capitalist commodification of human life itself. That is what was at stake in our enslavement. That is what is at stake today. That is the reason why people around the world responded to the Floyd uprising, because they understood that if Black people can get free in the belly of the beast, then everybody gets free.
Wonderful. Dr. Armour, I wanted to go back to you for the other question to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, the last part of the question was, and I thought it was a good one, what about someone who is from a truly disadvantaged Black background, someone from a dark ghetto themselves, who says, I've maintained a morally spotless record, or at least criminally spotless, right? And that shows you that you can avoid criminal wrongdoing coming from disadvantaged circumstances. Right, and that's what I heard the question being, and it's one that you used to hear all the time, and you're going to hear a lot, from now on out. People saying, well, do we want to blame crime on criminogenic conditions like crumbling schools or hunger or lack of jobs or lack of adequate housing, or do we want to blame it on people's internal moral failings, their deficient character, right? And both when it comes to crime and poverty, we have a tradition in this country of explaining both crime and poverty as a reflection of people's inner deficiencies, their character deficiencies, not the external factors that they're facing. You really saw this first in the poverty setting, in the kind of economic setting, in a book called The Other America, in the early 60s by Michael Harrington. He was otherwise viewed as a liberal. He came out with, he discovered in The Other America poor Americans in the early 60s, right? 4 groups of poor Americans he discovered, right? And they were, elderly people, rural, a lot of people in rural America, Black folk, and Appalachians, I think were the 4 groups. He discovered poverty. And then he said, okay, good enough, people are starting to confront poverty. He came up with an explanation for it that has haunted us ever since. His explanation was, those people are poor because of their culture of poverty. If it wasn't for their culture of poverty, they wouldn't be mired in, hopelessness and economic want, right? You see the exact same arguments made in LA when it came to policing Skid Row. In 2006, they created the Safer Cities Initiative in LA, in which they put many new officers. They made downtown LA what we call the nickel here, which is the fiercest expression of structural violence in America, by the way. It's the largest concentration of homelessness folk in America, right down here, Skid Row, right, the nickel. They put more police on there than anywhere else in America under the Safer Cities Initiative. And the idea was, we're going to solve the problem of poverty with the police. They were very explicit about it. We're going to crack down on the down and out for their own good. This is paternalistic policing, therapeutic policing, right? The idea is the reason they're poor is because of their internal deficiencies. They lack moral fiber, moral character, and a lot of other internal factors. And so they need to be sent to these mega shelters and put on these 12-step programs, essentially, that will repair their inner brokenness. And that is the solution to poverty, right? And we spent hundreds of millions of dollars in LA pursuing that wrong-headed policy, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We just kept pouring money into cracking down on the down and out, pursuing the same wrong-headed approach to crime, to the poor that we did to the crime, and saying, no, it's all internal factors, not external. And so, yeah, part of the conceptual shift I'm talking about is that we need to fundamentally rethink how people turn to crime, not just because of internal depravity, but because of external factors like lack of jobs, and because they're stuck in criminogenic conditions. And that's the same reason that they're in poverty too. Not because of internal deficiencies again, but because of lack of adequate safety net support and other kinds of support.
Great. Okay, so we have one last question from Matthew. Go ahead, Matthew.
Actually, why don't you let one of the other speakers ask their question, like one of the audience members not on Zoom.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and we can. Is any other Q&A panelists have any more questions you want to ask? Looks like no. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the other questions. One of the questions is from Kabir. How can more justice be brought to the cannabis industry, which has a history of horrible racial injustice? Pamela, you want to try that one?
Sure. I mean, we know that the pre-cannabis industry, which has been, and it has been it's been a different kind of industry, but certainly the use, as the speakers have pointed out, the use of the war on drugs to incarcerate people and disenfranchise people that was specific and intentional, and has persisted even as we in California decriminalized marijuana. It has still continued, and it's part of what Dr. Armour was talking about and what Dr. Ware is talking about. The whole idea that is of our criminal justice system and our economic system is to essentially oppress, is based on white supremacy. And so any Black or brown person attempting to make an advance in any industry and attempting to turn around the way that particularly the war on drugs has been utilized and cannabis has been utilized, that is going to encounter resistance. Fundamentally, it's difficult to challenge it because of the way that it's embedded in there and the whole origin of the thing. So, moving forward, we've got to continue to look at how the war on drugs has harmed communities of color and what specific things can be done to ameliorate that harm, whether it's economic measures that need legislation, both locally and statewide, that needs to address the racial disparities and how licenses are granted and who gets to benefit from the cannabis industry as we move forward, as well as how we look at where are the people who were sentenced under the war on drugs and how do we get to them and make sure that we are actively using the mechanisms that now exist to re-sentence folks based on those crazy convictions and the racial disparities in prosecution.
Dr. Armour, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Certainly one way is, real equity in distributing the licenses. We're supposed to have something like that, a regulatory agency in LA to make sure that, they got licenses for everything from growing through retail and the other kinds of accessories that are associated with it, that a lot of those licenses were supposed to go to people who were bearing the brunt of the war on drugs, the marijuana war in particular, but the war on drugs, by making sure they went to people who served time for drug offenses, et cetera. So there was a lot of rhetoric to that effect and a lot of high hopes, and it didn't pan out. It fell flat in the actual delivery of that kind of equity in the cannabis, in the distribution of cannabis licenses here. So it's just evidence again that even once you win you think you won the rhetorical battle to some extent and gotten a concession that this is the right thing to do, unless you are on them like hawks constantly. And even then, you're not assured to make sure that they are going to follow through. A lot of times it won't happen.
Great. Any of our Q&A panelists have any thoughts on that question? Okay, cool. We'll go ahead and go to the next question. The next one is from Lisa. I think Tony Thurman wanted to tax businesses that profited from the prison industrial complex and take that tax and give it back to the communities for early childhood education. Does anyone know about this and thoughts on it? Pamela or Jody? I've never heard of it.
You know, I hear you, you know, look, I worry a little because you know, a lot of Biden came out with an executive, you know, order saying something about what he was going to do with private prisons. And, you know, there was a lot of fanfare around that. And then, you know, just a few colleagues recognized, and if you were part of this conversation for a long time, you recognize that private prisons aren't the reason we have the explosion in the prison population, the reason we got the new Jim Crow. It is public prisons. The vast majority of prisoners are in public prisons. Public prisons are for-profit prisons. There are a lot of lobbies for corrections officers and a lot of other people who see a lot of money in public corrections. So, you know, sometimes I think we gotta recognize that this problem is so broad. You know, we can talk about, well, you know, taxing businesses that profit from prisons, but they're also businesses that profit from environmental racism. There are businesses that profit from a lot of societal, you know, illnesses that and ills that we need to just confront directly. You know, we need to just say we need to cut down the footprint of prisons, period. We need to defund the police, you know, cut back on the things we call crimes, radically reduce prisons, move toward real abolition at a fundamental level. And so, yeah, I guess that would be my quick response to that. I'm not too sanguine on the prospect of us actually being able to hold those who are profiteering from the caging of human beings accountable financially.
I have to agree. I mean, the fact is that the state is the primary profiteer of our state prisons. Incarcerated people do engage in a number of economic activities. They earn between 8 and 37 cents an hour. They fight fires. They produce goods for the state to sell. They support the entire foundation of incarceration is built on the people who are actually incarcerated. And then we use them as cheap labor, as essentially slave labor in the state of California. That's fundamentally, I mean, we don't need to tax private prisons. We need to decarcerate the prisons that we have. And it's the same at this county level. You'll see that as well. There's such a huge profit motive in the county facilities where people are being charged for being incarcerated. In California, we just eliminated, inmates were forced to make co-pays for medical and dental services. Inmates are forced to pay astronomical amounts for phone calls and services. So the state is clearly profiteering off of incarceration. And so that would need to be the focus. And not just the state, but as I say, the county as well.
You know, you all make me think of a couple other things, especially Dr. Armour. During the time I was mayor, I used to go up and visit Geronimo twice a month when he was in prison. And it was amazing to go visit Geronimo when they take you into the outer section where they bring people in to field people. In white, brown, yellow prisoners would all invite their relatives to come and meet Geronimo. Because Geronimo had such a personality of reorganizing and teaching and giving such an analysis. Now they should take that under consideration. Some of the people doing time are some of the greatest reorganizers that could upgrade the quality of life from a system standpoint, whatever else. and show you how to make these persons more fundamental people in the workforce, et cetera, whatever else, for which they could be let out much earlier, et cetera, whatever else. But of course, nobody examines that kind of stuff.
Any other thoughts from the Q&A panelists? Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question.
Yes, I just
Oh.
want to say, this is Antoine. When I founded the organization in Richmond, the history of Richmond, we were ran by the Cowboys, which was the police officers. They were murderers, they were embezzlers, they were doing all kind of crazy stuff. But they ran Richmond with a strong arm and a strong foot. And the Black community was, we feared them. And so when they were dismantled in the early 80s, early 80s, they were dismantled. And things in Richmond started changing a little bit. And so when in the drug war, the fascist war we had here in the early 80s, late 80s and late 90s, we had the highest murder rate per capita in the United States of America in Richmond. And it kind of, my experience, when the reentry process came, and I saw the change in how it could better the community, because the parole officer, if you know how the system works, the parole officer was never always violating people for being with each other. I mean, when they signed to get out of jail, it's like the young man said, you know, it's just you're signing your life away, because they're going to dictate everything you do to violate you to go back to do another term. And so when the reentry process, we were so successful at Men and Women of Purpose, because we were out in the community, we had the connections with the union jobs, we were doing family unification, we were doing drug court, we were doing homeless court, giving people back their licenses and everything to be, you know, to get their lives back, to get jobs and things like that. But after I left, all that stopped, because they were just in the jail, you know, just doing the same thing everybody else was doing. And so now, you know, it's just, you know, when you have passion for this work for the people, they don't want passion and for the people. They want people who want passion for the money. I'm passionate for lives. I'm not passionate for money. You know, it's like working for the slave master, if you like that. I mean, that's how I look at it. But when you out here doing the work for the people, you're not working in that circle. You don't have that mindset. You want to see people get their lives back and their families back and get families reunified again. And so, you know, that's what my driving force is. That's why I come to panels like this, and I'm invited to speak at different things and recovery stuff like that. So to give people hope and know how to do it the right way. Thank you.
Thanks, Antoine. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next question, which is from Alachu. This is kind of a joke, but also has a salient point to it that we should talk about. Why do we still have jaywalking as a crime in this century? So I guess Dr. Armour and
we want to be able to profile people. We want to be able to selectively enforce the law, because we know that people are jaywalking all the time, constantly. You know, millions of people every day are jaywalking. All right, and so it's like a lot of crimes. You know, if you outside my house here, you have one highway is called the 110. If you get on the 110, the speed limit is 55 miles an hour. Now, nobody on the 110 is doing 55 miles an hour if the traffic is moving. When I get on the 110, minimum is 65 miles an hour, 60, 65 miles. Everybody's doing, if you're doing 55, people are starting to blow their horns, right? But so everybody's breaking the law. Everybody's going up the highway doing 65 miles an hour or more. And so when a police officer pulls you over, let's say a police officer pulls you over and says, okay, you were doing 65, right? And you got to say, yeah, I was breaking the law. I can't argue I wasn't doing 65, but you still may have a problem if you say, but officer, the only motorists you're pulling over for doing 65 are Black, or a disproportionate number of them, like 70% of them are Black, you know? And you never get to that question a lot of times for a lot of people, because they'll just say, well, why were you breaking the law? You know, if you weren't breaking the law, you wouldn't have anything to complain about. No, the selective enforcement of the law is a separate harm. You know, in the old Soviet Union, they used to say, you know, we'll criminalize everything. And this was a misrepresentation of the Soviet Union, by the way. So when they were trying to describe fascist countries, and this was the wrong example, but criminalize everything, then selectively enforce the law, right? And that way you can always, you know, kind of channel, social engineer. Nobody can say, you know, they weren't breaking the law. You know, you have a lot of people on the right who used to say, comply or die. Why are all these people, these hashtags in the Black Lives Matter movement, Walter Scott, Eric Garner, comply or die, just comply with the law, you know, or die, you know, but they weren't saying that in DC a couple of weeks ago when you had that insurrection, right? And for the most part, there would have been a massacre. So yeah, that is just something that's everyday part of police enforcement in America.
Yeah, I saw a talk with a former cop that called it the messing with laws. Well, he used a different word instead of messing with. It starts with an F. But he's basically like, yeah, those are laws that cops have to mess with people whenever they want to. Pamela, did you have any thoughts? Oh, it looks like you're muted.
Yeah, no, I think Dr. Armour said it all. Thank you.
Great. So let's go ahead and check out the next question. Just two more questions after this. Lisa, with another question, how can we get the average citizen to understand the reimagining of these concepts? I am fairly aware of these ideals and values, but even I have to work to get to what is going on here. How can we create messaging to get the people to rise up for this justice reform?
For me, I think it is critical to bring the data to people's understanding, to talk over and over again. I have to always talk about how Black people are 5 times more likely to be stopped in Alameda County, how Black youth are 86% of all the juvenile felony arrests in Alameda County, how Black people in Oakland are 5 times more likely to be stopped by the police. I think the data is there and it's irrefutable. It reflects the everyday experience that most people don't have, white people don't have. And so you have to let them know constantly, this is what is happening. And that message has to get out there that there is a double standard and that double standard has so many consequences, whether it's being stopped arbitrarily under these ridiculous laws, to being incarcerated in the county jail, to being, criminalized for your poverty, because understanding if you get arrested, you get stopped, you get arrested, you haven't committed a crime, but if you go to Santa Rita County Jail, you can't get out because they're gonna set bail, and people who can't get out because they don't have bail money, you could lose your house, you could lose your car, you could lose your kids. For women, we lose our children because we get criminalized in this way and we don't have the resources to fight the state. So then you take a plea deal because I need to get out, right? And now I've got a conviction that becomes the basis. Maybe it's not a felony the first time, but then it becomes the basis for another felony. I mean, it is a cycle that people have to understand step by step by step. You have to break it down to them and show them that it's real and how it undermines the whole fabric of the community. As we look at police violence in Alameda County, I often use Lonnie Ganier's analogy that Black people are the miner's canary. If we go into the mine, we die, okay? The miners used to send the canary in. If the canary went in and did not come back out, that meant the mine was messed up and mine was poison, toxic for everybody. Black people are the miner's canary in America. This system is toxic for everyone, and we are dying. And it needs to be a wake-up call for everybody in this country that this is not a system that serves people, that cares for people. It is not a just or humane system, and we have got to fix it. It's on us. The Wakandans are not coming.
That's true. Dr. Armour, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree that, data, facts matter a lot. One of the problems is people don't have a reliable common source of facts and data. You know, we don't have, journalism is an important tool, right, for us to make sure the stories get out, the progress continues, but a lot of people are living in their hermetically sealed, you know, little silos, their echo chambers when it comes to information sources, which is why you can have people in DC, you know, talking about the election was a fraud. I mean, you know, irrespective of whatever else you thought about what they were doing, how right or wrong it was, just the factual world, you know, the reality they were living in had no evidence for it. It was not evidence that there were no judges who were agreeing them. There were no lawmakers, legislative chambers that came out. There was just no support for it. You know, I know that some conspiracy theories can be true. You know, Iran-Contra, the CIA, or COINTELPRO. You know, so I'm not against the idea that there can be some skullduggery going on out here, but they had zero evidence. And so what was scary about that is it showed how we can't even start to talk about a common purpose without a common truth. And we can't get a common truth without reliable sources of data and facts, right? And we don't have that. You know, you have an MSNBC crowd, a Fox crowd, a CNN crowd. Nobody's talking to one another. The MSNBC crowd can be like Fox for the liberals. You know, they can get in their own echo chamber and talk about, for example, the Russians hijacked the election in 2016. You know, and Mueller is going to prove it. He didn't. It wasn't the Russians. It was America. That was us. You know, we put Trump in 2016, and 75 million of us voted for him again in 2020. He wasn't an aberration. That wasn't a Russian, plot that made those 75 million people vote for Trump. This is us. This is America. You know, we're deeply divided. It's a battle for the soul of the nation going on. And so, yeah, and it's around a lot of criminal justice reform. And so, yes, when the question is, how do we make these changes? One is good data. The other, for me, I've been doing a lot with the arts. You know, I wrote a play, Race, Rap, and Redemption, brought in a lot of artists, asked, should we pour liquor for Tukey, Stanley Tukey Williams, just been put to death by Arnold Schwarzenegger as the governor back then, and got the crowd of 1,100 students, faculty, and staff to stand up with their lighters for Stanley Tukey Williams as an expression of sympathetic identification with really a first-degree murderer who co-founded the Crips, but through art, through, spoken word, through dance, through music, through narratives that brought the audience into the alternative perspective of these, people that they otherwise marginalize and don't know anything about. They were able to empathize and grow from that. So art is another, one of the tools that we need to deploy.
Great. Yeah, everything you said is basically right on. Okay, so now we have two questions that are kind of controversial, but let's go ahead and see. And you can answer no comment if you want to also. So I'm going to ask the last one first. Does the panel want to discuss the realities of Kamala Harris's iffy criminal justice history, as so many are glorifying her history as DA of California?
Oh yeah, I'll just jump in real quick. I have her in the prologue to my book. Right at the beginning of my book, I talk about two people who are representative of the problems that we're going to have with criminal justice reform. I say, one is one of the architects of mass incarceration, Joe Biden, 94 crime bill, before then, after then, as late as 2016, he was saying, I don't have any regrets about anything I did earlier. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who here in California, as we know, is talking about locking up parents for truing 16, 17-year-old kids, didn't prosecute any corrupt DAs as Attorney General, laughed when someone asked her about marijuana legalization at the time the Black community was bearing the brunt of legal, criminal justice in the marijuana context, right? So she definitely is not a progressive prosecutor, which she claimed to be in her memoir. She should have just owned that. I'm not a progressive prosecutor. I'm not Chesa Boudin. I never was Chesa Boudin. I'm not, Marilyn Mosby. I never was Marilyn Mosby. I've learned, then was then. I was caught up in the time I've learned, and I'm going to grow and change. That's what you should have said. But no, I've always been a progressive prosecutor. And then your record just keeps looking you in the face and contradicting you, and it sounds silly, right? So that's what you should have done. But you know, what we did here in LA was say that, you know, representational politics alone ain't enough. We aren't doing politics of pigmentation standing alone in LA. Jackie Lacey was a Black woman who put her social identity at the top of her campaign. Bullet point 1, I'm the first Black woman DA. Bullet point 2, I'm the first woman DA, right? She made that. She said, that's going to insulate me from any real criticism from the Black Lives Matter people. It didn't, because the Black Lives Matter folks were themselves Black women, for the most part. And they were saying, no, we're looking for substantive policies. We're not going to just play this game of social identity, you know, trumps everything else. So I think there's a real growing sophistication among a lot of the electorate, Black electorate, non-Black electorate, when it comes to this kind of representational game that sometimes people play.
I wish that I could see more of what you are saying, because I was a very vocal critic of Kamala Harris's record as Attorney General and before her ascension, and based on not only the record, but my own personal experience with her as a civil rights attorney. And that I'm on record around that. What I have discovered, though, is that the representational issue has become paramount. It's been exploited, no question about it. And so the notion that young Black girls can look up to her as a representation of themselves and of what they can achieve, and the idea that she is now the vice president, and most people assume that she's going to be the president because that's American politics, right? These are challenges for us as progressives, because we understand that she is not and never was a progressive prosecutor. And you're absolutely right. The strategy would have been that. But, you know, Kamala was someone who locked up Black Lives Matter activists. Kamala was someone who completely rejected feminist movements in California. Now she is touted by the popular media and the establishment Democrats as the epitome of Black women. She has support amongst the Black community now because she represents the image of that. And so we have a lot of work to do to get people to look underneath that image, to look beyond that image, and to understand that there is a difference between Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas. Hello.
Yeah.
You know, that there is a difference between Jackie Lacey and Chesa Boudin. Hello. That there has to be, we have to recognize that all skin folk are not kinfolk. And being able we can only say that, right? We can only say that. And we got to keep saying that and keep saying it so that our folks get it. Okay.
I think what it shows also is how little knowledge the majority of Black people have about some of our officials who have served in different positions. Those statistics don't come out. They don't hit the breakdown on the kind of role that Pamela played when she was DA or whatever. I mean, all you gotta do is go back and look and see what her father said about her, who was a Marxist economist professor at Stanford. And he came out and said, all right, tell the truth. And then furthermore, you know, I was on the committee on the question of Palestine at the United Nations. I knew Edward Said. He's been shown hugging Netanyahu and whatever else. That a country which is more detrimental in its treatment. I went over to Palestine right after the Second Intifada, and I've never seen an apartheid situation like that anywhere in the world. A lot of our Black Americans don't understand that, and they will just accept certain things, this and whatever else. And I'm not talking about, you know, being anti-Semitic. I'm talking about, but I'm against pure Zionism of the highest degree. And that stuff's got to be exposed. If we claim to be the spokesperson and created a world that's going to benefit and create a society where all people can learn to live side by side, then let's get the facts straight and let's practice.
And there's
That's
no
actually-
question that Kamala is very much a profound and professed Zionist. She believes and supports the apartheid regime in Israel. We do not control the media. And the narrative that most Black people are getting and most white people in this country is coming from the media, which is, you know, given this flowery representation of who she is without actually balancing it. And it's unfortunate that, from my perspective, that she is a Black woman and that it is deceptive to our people, quite frankly.
Yeah, the corrupt corporate media is definitely a problem. And one of our town halls is called Media Justice. We are going to talk just about exactly that. One more question from Joaquin, our board member. Do you think defund the police is a good slogan? Either Dr. Armour or Pamela.
Hell yes. Hell yeah. And I'm so tired. I'm so tired of the lecturing and policing of Black Lives Matter political messaging by people who haven't been on the front line making this movement happen since 2014, you know, out here in the streets getting kettled by police, getting beaten, you know, people like Melina Abdullah, you know, getting a tent outside the mayor's office and being on the street for 4 weeks in a row, you know, people hurling objects at her and other Black Lives Matter activists making these sacrifices and hearing all those same words. The same thing they're saying about don't say defund the police. They were saying about don't say Black Lives Matter. Have we already forgotten? I remember vividly, you know, oh, all lives matter. And then, you know, then it turned to blue lives matter. Then they showed that they weren't being sincere because, oh, if it was always all lives matter, then why are you now all of a sudden wrapping your arms around blue lives matter? Because it's never really about, you understood what Black Lives Matter meant. Black Lives Matter always meant Black Lives Matter also. Black Lives Matter, comma, TOO. There was an implied ellipsis that people, anybody who thought about it could get if they wanted to get it, but if you wanted to be obtuse about it, you could. And it's the same thing with defund the police. You know, defund the police, it's a compromise already going in between abolish the police and reform the police. It's already a compromise position, right? But that's not good enough. No, it makes people nervous. You can't say that, right? And by the way, here in LA, we had a defund the police initiative on the ballot. It was called Measure J. It was defund the, it takes 10% of the LA County budget and that's up to $1 billion a year, up to $10 billion a year budget. So 10% up to $1 billion a year that is going to non-incarceration alternatives. The voters put that in, Measure J. And when we were pushing that Measure J down here, it wasn't called the defund the police measure. I acknowledge that up front. But all of the rallying, all the messaging, the going door to door and knocking, they were wrapping their arms around defund the police. That was the messaging. And it prevailed at the ballot box. So the gall of people who haven't been able to lead and this really most momentous movement of the last, how many, 40, 50 years? When has there been a movement like this? 40, 50 years, literally. You know, everybody was here over the summer. Everyone saw what we all experienced together, right? And that was made possible because of the organizing done by Black Lives Matter in 2014, 15, and 16. When the cameras went away, they kept building the infrastructure. They kept strengthening the sinews of connection. They were out in front of Jackie Lacey's office every Wednesday for 3 years, never rain or shine, right? And so you're going to tell them what slogans they need to use. You're gonna lecture them. You're gonna white-splain to them. You know how they should go about it. I'm just shocked. But I hear a lot of people saying that, and I'm always just a shock.
Yeah, we defunded the police when I was the mayor of Berkeley. It was right after Proposition 13 passed. We got the data though. We got a national organization, including McNamara at Stanford, the Criminal Justice Department, and other places to show us what kind of data you needed. We had to look at when crime was the highest, like between midnight and 6 in the morning, and from 6 to 12, whatever else. So you needed fewer officers on at certain times. But you didn't need police on desk jobs either, because they get paid more because of the insurance they get and whatever else. We also looked at co-training for police and fire, because firemen most of the time just sit around sleeping until the fire happened, which very few people know. You need the data. And then we had to look at where crime was highest, where gentrification taking place, where there wasn't good schools, where there wasn't jobs, et cetera, whatever else. Know what you're talking about to inform the changes that need to be made. And that's what we got to do. But like somebody said, you got MSNBC, speak to the liberals, you got Fox, speak to the other side just now. The corruption that's keeping us separated and making people look in between these things to get their decision is just terrible. And that's why we're 43rd in the world in literacy and education, 72nd in healthcare, and COVID-19 has really proven that. Look what they're talking about. I mean, I belong to the National Council of Elders. It was founded by Vincent Harding, who was Martin Luther King's speechwriter. And he had to be 65 or older. I'm 85. My granddaughter suggests I'm 4 years older in baseball, but things like that. But the fact is, you've got to have those facts and figures to inform and make something work. And those who think, I don't care how well educated you are, they got all the answers, go back and tell me what you got the answers for. Most of the time it's to perpetuate the status quo with the conditions that exist in these so-called United States of America.
Pamela, did you have any thoughts? Looks like you're muted.
Amen.
Yeah, me too. That's what I was thinking.
Amen.
So that was the last question from the audience. Wow, we went way over. Sorry, everyone. But this discussion was just too good. I didn't really care because I just wanted to capture everything. Matthew has one last question. I think after that, we're just going to go ahead and end it from there. Matthew, go ahead.
Sure. I guess I also wanted to ask this to Chesa Boudin, but I think Pamela Price would be still a good person to ask this of, because for reasons I'll go into. So one thing that Chesa ran on that I really liked was he talked about not just like not prosecuting these crimes that shouldn't be prosecuted, but also going after crimes that like aren't necessarily prosecuted. And I think examples of what you can see of that are, violations of open meetings laws, like the Brown Act. I think there's never been prosecution for that in the entire history of the state, or, campaign finance laws that, where it's in theory a misdemeanor to violate them in California, but you don't see like super PACs that like violate disclosure rules in California, like the people running them prosecuted or anything. One other thing that like is like notoriously violated is in California is the Public Records Act request. Like as an example, I submitted a Public Records Act request, something about Janet Napolitano, when she was UC president, had done something, and they just would kept ignoring my records request for year after year, until eventually she was no longer UC president, and there was no point. But what I realized was, for instance, Public Records Act request violations aren't actually, it's only a civil offense. It's not like a misdemeanor or an infraction. So what I was curious about was, do you think things like that, like the Brown Act or Public Records Act requests, should those types of things be, even as a regularly low level offense, should they be considered criminal offenses? Because then I can't sue to enforce them. I don't have any money, but a district attorney's office in theory has the resources and the money to go after those things. And I'd really like to hear particularly Pamela Price's answer, but everybody's answer, because both UC Berkeley and the UC Office of the President are in Alameda County. So your office would actually have a big influence, I think, on that. You're muted.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for the question. We know that part of the issue in the criminal justice system is who gets prosecuted, who gets targeted, and that there is a double standard. And so the resources of the carceral state have been focused on offenses by Black and brown people in communities and low-level offenses that police have discretion on that go to the district attorney's office. But public corruption is not one of those things that district attorneys have traditionally or even under any circumstances focused on. And certainly transparency is not a value that is part of our political process to get information in the political realm as well as the financial realm. You have to go through so much information, so many hassles. And so it doesn't surprise me that we have a major institution like the state of California and the University of California that does not honor the Public Records Act and will not produce that information. The district attorney's office in Alameda County has a long and well-established history of not following Public Records Act and not being transparent. And one area that I'm particularly focused on is the issuance of reports following officer-involved shootings. Those reports are routinely issued 6, 8, 10 years later, or a year later. It is like lightning fast, but that's only if it's in collaboration with the police department. And so district attorney's office, though, do more and have more scope around the kinds of things that you're talking about. They have the tools and the resources to engage in the enforcement to address public corruption, to engage in the enforcement of the laws in a not just in the criminal justice system, but in collaboration with city attorneys and through the use of civil statutes. Environmental activities are things that the DA's office is supposed to be monitoring. And so I don't agree necessarily that the kinds of violations that you're talking about should be criminalized, because I'm not trying to expand the carceral state, but I do recognize that the district attorney has an important role to play when we're talking about transparency, both in local government as well as state government. And DAs take positions all the time. As Chesa pointed out, through the California District Attorneys Association, they are regularly taking positions that are opposed to people being able to get information. That's why it was so impactful for us to have SB 1421 when police officer information was now able to be disclosed. So I can see a progressive district attorneys alliance taking up the kinds of issues that you're bringing up, which are important. It's only through that transparency that we do actually have public accountability. So thank you.
All right, and with that, we had taken our last question. So we're basically done with the very first Justice Town Hall series on criminal justice. I want to thank all of our speakers. They were wonderful. Dr. Ware, Dr. Armour, Pamela, and Chesa, and our Q&A panelists that asked wonderful questions, and our audience that asked some really incisive questions. So incisive that we went over by 45 minutes. So that turned out really good. So I wanted to invite everyone watching to join us. Our Revolution East Bay, here's our information, ourrevolutioneastbay.org, and you can email us. And to join the Coalition for Police Accountability, there's their website, and their email address is Kathy's email, kathy.leonard3@gmail.com. And Kathy, did you have any final words you wanted to toss out?
Yes, so I would encourage everyone to check out our website and follow us. You can email me for more information at kathy.leonard3@gmail.com and find out what our latest project is. We put Measure LL to bed, Measure S1, and we've got something coming up. So the work of the Coalition for Police Accountability to hold Oakland Police Department accountable is not over. And we will continue that fight. So join us. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, definitely hook up with CPA if you're in the East Bay area. They're doing some phenomenal work. Just the Oakland Police Commission is very stunning. Like somebody from Texas that looking at it, and I was just like stunned at how well it works. And then they added some extra enforcement this year with S1, which is great. All right, so that's actually it for the town hall.
Oh, can I make one?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I wanted to make one comment. I'm just reflecting back on what someone was, there was a request about police accountability, accountability, it's getting late, measures for Alameda County. And that's something that maybe the coalition may be looking at too, among other things that we're doing. So stay tuned, check out our Facebook page, email us, and let you know what's going on. Maybe you can join the efforts and help us out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Kathy. And yeah, this stream is actually going to be put on Facebook and YouTube. So everyone watching, don't forget to share the stream with everyone. And for everyone that missed it, you should tell them, hey, it was a really good town hall. You should check it out. So that's it for today. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and stop recording.